Miss Marple and the Child Who Knew the Murderer's Name. Good evening and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and it's so lovely to have you here again. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight and how has your day been? I always enjoy reading your messages. Don't forget to subscribe for new cozy mysteries every day. Now let's begin our story. Chapter 1, A Word at the Tea Table. The afternoon light slanted through the windows of Mrs. Harper's drawing room, touching the silver tea service with a gentle glow that spoke of well-maintained prosperity and quiet village life. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed chair near the fire, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, measured rhythm that had lulled many an unsuspecting soul into forgetting how very observant she could be. Much Ellering was not St. Mary Mead, but it possessed that same quality of genteel watchfulness that Miss Marple had come to recognize in English villages everywhere. One could tell a great deal about a place, she reflected, by the way its inhabitants poured tea and the subjects they chose to avoid in light conversation. Mrs. Harper was speaking of her roses, a topic that had occupied them pleasantly for the better part of 20 minutes. She was a comfortable sort of woman, perhaps 80, with that particular kind of anxious kindness that comes from having worried about other people's opinions for most of one's life. I do so appreciate your visiting, Miss Marple, Mrs. Harper was saying, refilling the cup with a practiced hand. One gets rather starved for intelligent conversation in a place like this. My daughter writes from London, of course, but it's not quite the same as having someone here to talk to. You have your granddaughter for company? Miss Marple observed gently. That must be a comfort. Oh, Daisy. Yes, of course. Mrs. Harper's smile grew warmer, though something indefinable flickered behind it. She's been with me since the spring. Her mother thought the country air would do her good after that dreadful winter cold. The child in question sat on the carpet near the window, apparently absorbed in her drawing. She was perhaps years old, a small, grave creature with dark hair, and the sort of stillness that Miss Marple had learned to recognize as the mark of a child who listened more than she spoke. Children are such a responsibility, Mrs. Harper continued, lowering her voice slightly. One never knows quite what to say to them, does one? And Daisy has such an imagination. She says the oddest things sometimes. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes rested thoughtfully on the child. I have always found, she said, that children are remarkably practical creatures. It is we adults who insist on calling their observations imagination. Before Mrs. Harper could respond, the door opened to admit a tall, spare woman in a nurse's uniform. Her face had that pinched look of professional disapproval, and she carried herself with the particular stiffness of someone who considered herself indispensable. I hope I'm not intruding, ma'am, she said, though her tone suggested she cared very little whether she was or not. I thought Daisy might need her cardigan. The room is rather draughty near the window. Thank you, Nanny Oakes, Mrs. Harper replied with a peculiar mixture of gratitude and irritation that employers often display toward long-serving staff. That's very thoughtful. The nurse crossed to the window, her shoes making sharp clicks against the floorboards. As she bent to drape the cardigan over the child's shoulders, her eye fell on the drawing, and something in her expression shifted. It was only a moment, but Miss Marple caught it, a flicker of something that might have been alarm. What are you drawing, child? Nanny Oakes asked, her voice carefully neutral. Daisy looked up, her face serene. A garden, she said simply, with an apple tree. Very nice, I'm sure. The nurse straightened, her hand resting briefly on the child's shoulder, in what might have been either affection or warning. You must show your grandmother when it's finished. She withdrew, closing the door with a firm click that seemed to punctuate something left unsaid. Mrs. Harper sighed. Nanny Oakes is devoted to Daisy, of course, but she does have rather strong opinions about everything. Still, one can't fault her dedication. Miss Marple made a small non-committal sound. She had known many devoted nurses in her time, and had observed that devotion could take remarkably varied forms, not all of them entirely healthy. The conversation drifted to other matters: the new vicar's rather long sermons, the questionable quality of the butcher's lamb, and the persistent problem of bindweed in the vegetable patch. Miss Marple contributed her share of gentle observations, while a part of her mind remained alert, noting and filing away small details. It was just as Mrs. Harper was offering a second slice of seed cake that the peculiar moment occurred. Daisy, who'd been silent for so long that the adults had almost forgotten her presence, looked up from her drawing. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and quite matter-of-fact, with none of the hesitation one might expect from a shy child interrupting her elders. "Nanny says he didn't do it. It was Mr. Partridge." The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. Harper's hand froze in midair, the cake knife suspended. Her face went quite white, then flushed pink. "Daisy," she said, her voice strangled, "whatever are you talking about?" But the child had already returned to her drawing, apparently having said all she intended to say. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. She had noticed in that frozen moment several things of interest. Mrs. Harper's shock had been genuine, but it had been accompanied by fear. The name Partridge had clearly meant something specific, something that sent a shock of recognition through her hostess's comfortable world. "I do apologize, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harper said, recovering herself with visible effort. "Children pick up such odd phrases. I can't imagine where she heard that name, or what she thinks she's referring to." "Can you not?" Miss Marple asked gently. Her knitting needles had stilled, and she was regarding her hostess with those mild, deceptively vague blue eyes that had seen through so many evasions. Mrs. Harper set down the cake knife, her hand trembling slightly. When she spoke, her voice was low. "You've only just arrived in Much Ellering, so perhaps you wouldn't know. But 3 years ago, there was a terrible crime here. Mrs. Olcott, a widow who lived in the old house beyond the church, was found strangled in her own home. The gardener was convicted. Henry Reed, a quiet man, but they said the evidence was overwhelming." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And this Mr. Partridge?" Gerald Partridge was Mrs. Olcott's late husband's business partner. He left the village shortly after the trial. I haven't heard his name spoken in years." Mrs. Harper's eyes moved to her granddaughter, and something like dread crossed her face. But Daisy was only 2 years old when it happened. She couldn't possibly remember anything about it, and she certainly never met Gerald Partridge. Miss Marple looked across at the child, who was carefully coloring something red in her drawing. The afternoon light caught her profile, giving her the look of a small grave angel absorbed in some private vision. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. She picked up her knitting once more, but her mind was fully engaged now, turning over the pieces of this unexpected puzzle. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "it would be interesting to know what your nanny has been saying to the child." Mrs. Harper's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Outside, the church clock struck 4, and somewhere in the village a dog began to bark. The peaceful afternoon had acquired an edge of something else, something that made the shadows seem longer and the firelight less comforting. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady clicking, but Hierys remained watchful. Chapter 2: The Child Who Remembered. The evening had drawn in with that particular softness peculiar to late autumn in the English countryside. Miss Marple had retired to her room after dinner, a comfortable chamber overlooking the garden, where she sat in a chintz-covered chair and considered the afternoon's extraordinary revelation. Mrs. Harper had been most anxious to dismiss the entire incident, attributing it to childish fancy and an overactive imagination. "From all of you. And then I think Mr. Grayson, or Partridge, or whatever he calls himself, is due for a visit from Scotland Yard." The confrontation, when it came 2 days later, was almost anticlimactic. Miss Marple insisted on being present, and Inspector Davies, perhaps recognizing that he owed the solution of the case to her persistence, agreed. Gerald Partridge's house stood beyond a meadow, just as Miss Marple had learned, with an orchard that contained an apple tree remarkably similar to the one in the old cot garden. When the police knocked at his door, he answered with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. That confidence crumbled rapidly when Inspector Davies presented the evidence. The letter fragment bearing his initials, the testimony of 2 witnesses who placed him at the scene, the wooden figure from the dollhouse, which he had presumably created or commissioned himself years ago, never imagining it would survive to condemn him. And finally, most damning of all, Caroline Olcott's message, written in a child's careful hand. "She was going to expose me," he said finally. After an hour of denials that grew progressively weaker, after all those years of keeping quiet, taking the money I gave her to stay silent about the irregularities in the partnership, she suddenly developed a conscience. Said she was going to tell the authorities everything, that she didn't care what it cost her. "So you killed her," Inspector Davies said flatly. "I only meant to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she'd been wrong to protect me, that her husband would have been ashamed of her silence." He stopped, seeming to realize what he was admitting. "And you strangled her with a curtain cord?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Then you arranged the scene to implicate Henry Reed, knowing his fingerprints would be everywhere from his work as her gardener." Partridge looked at her with something like hatred. "Who are you? Why couldn't you leave it alone?" "Because an innocent man was in prison," Miss Marple replied, "and because a child knew the truth, and children deserve to be believed." As Gerald Partridge was led away, Miss Marple thought of Caroline Olcott, who had tried so desperately to tell what she had seen. And she thought of Daisy, who had somehow connected with that long-ago child's memory through the toys she had left behind. Henry Reed was released from prison a week later. Miss Marple was there when he walked through the gates, and she saw the way he lifted his face to the autumn sun as though he had forgotten what freedom felt like. On her last day in Much Ellering, Miss Marple found Daisy playing under the apple tree in Mrs. Harper's garden. The child looked up and smiled, and Miss Marple saw that the haunted look had left her eyes. "Is it finished?" Daisy asked. "Is the bad man being punished?" "Yes, my dear. Justice has finally been done. Because I remembered. Because you remembered. And because you were brave enough to speak the truth, even when grown-ups told you it was only imagination." Miss Marple sat down beside her on the grass. "You've done something very important, Daisy. You've helped set a wrong to right." The child was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you think Caroline is happy now?" Miss Marple looked up at the apple tree, its branches moving gently in the breeze. "I think she is. I think she's been waiting all these years for someone to listen. And you listened, my dear. You heard what she was trying to say." As Miss Marple prepared to leave Much Ellering the following morning, the church bells rang out for Sunday service, clear and unburdened. She stood for a moment listening to them, thinking about truth and justice, and the strange ways they sometimes revealed themselves. Children often know the truth first, she reflected. Only the grown-ups insist on explaining it away. She picked up her bag and walked toward the station, where the train would carry her back to St. Mary Mead. Behind her, the village settled back into its peaceful routine, though it would never quite forget the elderly lady who had seen what others had missed, and who had believed a child when no one else would. She had spoken rather too much and rather too quickly on the subject, which Miss Marple had found illuminating in itself. People who had nothing to hide, in her experience, rarely felt compelled to explain quite so thoroughly. The household had settled into its evening routine. Downstairs, she could hear the muted sounds of Mrs. Harper's wireless tuned to some pleasant musical program. Nanny Oakes had taken her supper on a tray in the nursery, as was apparently her custom. Miss Marple had observed this arrangement with interest. Devoted nurses who isolated themselves with their charges often had particular reasons for doing so. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reflections. "Come in," she called, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read. The door opened to reveal Daisy, dressed in a white nightgown and clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The child stood on the threshold, solemn and uncertain. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, with the careful politeness of a child who'd been well instructed in manners. "Nanny's asleep and I couldn't settle." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Would you like to come in for a moment? I was just thinking how very quiet it is up here, and how pleasant a little company would be." The child entered, closing the door with surprising care. She perched on the edge of the ottoman near Miss Marple's chair, arranging her nightgown precisely around her knees. "Grandmother was upset this afternoon," Daisy said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Because of what I said about Mr. Partridge. Were you worried about that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not worried exactly." The child considered this with a gravity beyond her years. "But I don't like when grown-ups get that look, the one that means they're frightened but pretending they're not." Miss Marple felt a small shock of recognition. This was no ordinary child parroting phrases overheard from adults. This was a small person who watched and understood, perhaps more than was comfortable for those around her. "That's very observant of you," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, Daisy, why did you say that about Mr. Partridge, that he did it instead of the man who went to prison?" The child looked at her directly, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw something that made her certain this conversation mattered. There was no guile in those dark eyes, but there was memory, clear and specific. "Because I saw him that day," Daisy said simply. "In the garden. He had red gloves." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her book. She kept her voice carefully neutral. "The day Mrs. Olcott died, do you mean?" "Yes, I was very small, but I remember. Nanny had taken me out in the pram because I was being fussy. We went past the big house, the one with the apple tree, and I saw the man with the red gloves. He was coming out of the garden gate, walking very quickly. He looked angry. And you're quite certain it was winter, when you were only 2 years old?" "It was cold," Daisy said. "There was frost on the grass. I remember because Nanny kept tucking the blanket around me and saying, 'We mustn't catch our death.'" She paused, frowning slightly. "I didn't understand then why people said that about catching death. You can't really catch it, can you? Like catching a ball?" "No, my dear." Miss Marple found herself deeply moved by this mixture of childish literalness and disturbing clarity. "It's just something people say. But tell me, how did you know the man's name was Partridge?" "I didn't then. But later, after Mrs. Olcott died, people kept talking about it. The ladies who came to tea with Grandmother and Nanny would tell me things when we were alone. She said the wrong man had been blamed and that the real bad man was Mr. Partridge. But nobody would listen because he was rich and important." The child's voice had taken on a slightly sing-song quality, as though repeating words she'd heard many times. "Nanny said Mr. Partridge had red gloves that day, fine leather ones, and he'd come to the house and done something terrible." Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. "Does your Nanny often tell you things like this?" "Sometimes when she's sad and thinks I'm not really listening." Daisy hugged her rabbit closer. "She gets sad a lot, especially when she talks about Mrs. Olcott. She says it's not right what happened, that good men shouldn't suffer for bad men's crimes." "Your Nanny knew Mrs. Olcott then?" "I think so. She doesn't say exactly, but I can tell by the way she talks about her." The child yawned suddenly, the gravity of her expression giving way to ordinary tiredness. "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have said anything at tea. Nanny told me not to speak of it, but sometimes I forget." "You haven't done anything wrong," Miss Marple assured her. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is tell the truth, even when others would prefer us to be silent." Daisy looked at her with something like relief. "You believe me?" "About the red gloves. I believe you saw something, my dear. And I believe it troubles you to keep it secret." The child nodded slowly. "Grandmother says I have a big imagination, that I make up stories." "I don't think so," Miss Marple said quietly. "I think you remember something real, something important. And I think your nanny has been trying in her way to help you make sense of what you saw." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The elderly woman and the small child, united by an understanding that transcended the decades between them. "It should go back now," Daisy said finally, "before Nanny wakes and worries." "Of course." Miss Marple rose and opened the door for her. "Thank you for visiting me, Daisy. You've been very brave to tell me these things." The child paused in the doorway. "Do you think they'll let the gardener out of prison? If they know he didn't do it." "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that if what you remember is true, then justice will find a way. It often does, given time and the right sort of attention." Daisy smiled, a small, solemn smile, and slipped away down the corridor. Miss Marple closed the door and stood for a long moment in thought. Then she crossed to her writing desk and drew out a small notebook she kept for such purposes. In her neat, precise hand, she began to write red leather gloves, winter, day, man leaving Mrs. Olcott's garden in haste, child as witness, Nanny Oakes's informant connection between nanny and victim beneath. This she added a line from long experience. Children do not imagine what they never saw, only what they were told to forget. Outside, an owl called from the old elm tree, and the village clock struck 9. Miss Marple sat down again with her knitting, but her mind was far from the pattern she was working. Somewhere in this quiet village, a man sat in prison for a crime he might not have committed. And somewhere else, perhaps nearer than anyone knew, a murderer believed himself safe. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the lamplight. She had seen this pattern before, in different villages with different names, the innocent accused, the guilty unpunished, and always some small detail overlooked by those too ready to accept the obvious answer. Well, she thought, we shall see about that. Chapter 3. The Toy That Shouldn't Exist. Miss Marple had always believed that breakfast was the most revealing meal of the day. People were less guarded in the morning, their social masks not yet fully in place, and one could learn a great deal from observing who spoke and who remained silent, who met one's eye, and who studied their toast with undue concentration. Mrs. Harper was determinedly cheerful, speaking rather too brightly about the weather and the possibility of a walk into the village. Nanny Oakes, who had brought Daisy down for her morning milk, stood by the sideboard with the rigid posture of someone who considered herself above sitting with the family, but beneath leaving the room entirely. Daisy herself was quiet, eating her porridge with careful attention, and darting occasional glances at Miss Marple that suggested their conversation of the previous evening weighed on her mind. "I thought perhaps," Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup, "that Daisy might show me her drawings this morning. I'm quite interested in children's artwork. My great-nephew sends me the most charming pictures from his school." Mrs. Harper's smile became, if possible, even more fixed. "Oh, I'm not sure that would be interesting to you, Miss Marple. Children's scribbles, you know. Nothing very accomplished." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied mildly, "I find children's drawings most illuminating. They show us how the young mind processes what it observes." Nanny Oakes had gone quite still, though she continued to face away from the table. Miss Marple observed the stiffness in her shoulders with interest. "Perhaps after breakfast," Mrs. Harper said weakly. "If Daisy would like to show you?" "I would," Daisy said, speaking for the first time. "I have lots of drawings in the nursery." The nursery, when Miss Marple visited it an hour later, proved to be a large, well-appointed room at the back of the house, with windows overlooking the garden. It had the comfortable, slightly shabby quality of a space that had served multiple generations of children. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint faded. A bookshelf held an assortment of volumes, ranging from pristine new picture books to ancient dog-eared copies of fairy tales. And against the far wall stood a magnificent dollhouse, clearly an antique piece of some value. Daisy led Miss Marple to a small table, where several drawings lay scattered. Most were the sort of pictures one might expect from a 5-year-old: houses with smoking chimneys, stick-figure families, flowers with improbably large petals, but others were different, more careful, more detailed. "These are the ones of the garden," Daisy said, pointing to 3 pictures that showed, with surprising accuracy for one so young, a house with an apple tree agate, and in 2 of them, a figure with distinctly red hands. "You draw very well," Miss Marple said truthfully. "You have an excellent memory for details." "Nanny says I notice too much," Daisy replied, then looked guilty, as though she'd said something she shouldn't. Miss Marple's attention had been caught by the dollhouse. It was a beautiful piece, Victorian perhaps, with real glass windows and elaborate architectural details. "What a lovely toy," she said. "May I look more closely?" "It used to belong to someone else," Daisy said. "A girl who lived here before. Grandmother said I could play with it, but I have to be very careful." Miss Marple approached the dollhouse, bending to examine it with the thoroughness she applied to everything. The furniture inside was exquisite, clearly handmade. There was a drawing room, a dining room, bedrooms upstairs, and in the nursery section, a collection of tiny dolls. One of them caught her eye immediately. It was a small carved figure, perhaps 3 inches tall, wearing a painted suit, and its hands had been painted a distinct red color. Beside it, tucked into the miniature furniture, was a scrap of paper yellowed with age, bearing a label in faded ink. Mr. P. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained pleasantly vague. "What an interesting little figure," she said. "Do you know who Mr. P is meant to be?" Daisy came to stand beside her, peering into the dollhouse. "I don't know. I found him when I was arranging the furniture. He was in the attic room all by himself. The attic room in the dollhouse, I mean. There's a little door at the top that opens. Lots of things were stored there. Old newspapers made of real paper, tiny books, and him." She pointed at the red-handed figure. "I see." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And when did you find him?" "When I first came to stay with grandmother. In the spring. I was arranging everything properly, and I found the attic door. Nanny said the dollhouse used to belong to Mrs. Olcott's daughter a long time ago. They sold it at a church sale after Mrs. Olcott died, and grandmother bought it for me." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, the sort of pattern she had learned to recognize over many years of observation. A dollhouse from the old house. A small figure with red hands marked as Mr. P. The child who began speaking of Mr. Partridge and red gloves only after she'd been playing with this particular toy. "May I borrow this little figure for a day or 2? Miss Marple asked. "And thellable? I'd like to show them to someone who knows about antique toys. They might be quite valuable." Daisy looked uncertain. "I suppose so, but you'll bring them back." "I promise." Miss Marple carefully extracted both the figure and the label, wrapping them in her handkerchief. "You've been very helpful, my dear." A sound at the door made them both turn. Nanny Oakes stood there, her expression unreadable. "Daisy, it's time for your lessons," she said. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Harper wondered if you might like some coffee in the drawing room." "How kind." Miss Marple rose, tucking the handkerchief carefully into her pocket. "Thank you for showing me your drawings and your lovely dollhouse. Daisy," as she followed Nanny Oakes down the corridor, Miss Marple said conversationally, "I understand the dollhouse came from the old cot. What a sad business that was. Did you know the family well?" Nanny Oakes's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "I knew of them, ma'am, as everyone in the village did." "Of course." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost apologetic. "Forgive my curiosity. It's a terrible habit of mine." "I understand Mrs. Olcott had a daughter." "She did. Miss Caroline. She married and moved away years before the tragedy. The house was let after that until Mrs. Olcott returned to it as a widow." Nanny Oakes's voice had become clipped, professional. "I really know very little about it, ma'am. I wasn't in much Ellering at the time, but you were nearby. You mentioned to Daisy about the wrong man being punished." The nurse stopped at the top of the stairs and turned. Her face was pale, and for a moment Miss Marple saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Daisy has too much imagination," she said. "She pieced together things she overhears and creates stories. I may have spoken unwisely. The child was asking questions, and I said what seemed kind at the moment." "The truth is often kind," Miss Marple observed mildly. "And sometimes it's dangerous, ma'am." Nanny Oakes's voice was barely above a whisper. "For all concerned." She turned and descended the stairs, her back rigid with suppressed emotion. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her hand resting lightly on the banister. In her pocket, wrapped in linen, lay a small wooden figure with red painted hands and a label that read, "Mr. P." Such a small thing. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that murders often turned on small things. A word overheard, a toy remembered, a child's clear vision unclouded by adult certainty. She thought of Mrs. Olcott's daughter who had owned this dollhouse. Had that child witnessed something terrible? Had she tried in her way to leave a message? And had that message, lying hidden in an attic room, waited for another child to find it? The morning sun streamed through the landing window, but Miss Marple felt a distinct chill. Somewhere in this puzzle lay the truth, and someone, she was quite certain, was very afraid of that truth coming to light. Chapter 4. The Prisoner's Letter. Miss Marple had never been one to act precipitously, but neither did she believe in allowing grass to grow beneath one's feet when justice hung in the balance. By Tuesday morning, she had composed a carefully worded letter to the prison authorities requesting permission to visit Henry Reed. And by Thursday afternoon she found herself in the visitor's room of His Majesty's prison at Marchwood, some 30 miles distant. The room was drab and cheerless, as such places invariably were, with a persistent smell of disinfectant failing to mask something less pleasant beneath. Miss Marple sat on a hard wooden chair and arranged her handbag and gloves with her usual precision, aware of the warder's curious gaze. Elderly spinsters were not, she suspected, common visitors to convicted murderers. When Henry Reed was brought in, Miss Marple felt an immediate conviction that whatever else this man might be, he was no killer of defenseless women. He had the weathered face of one who had spent his life outdoors, with deep lines around the eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind. His hands, as he sat down across from her, were large and work-worn, but they trembled slightly as he folded them on the scarred table between them. "I don't understand, miss," he said, his voice carrying the soft burr of the local countryside. "They seed a lady wanted to see me, but I don't know any ladies." "Not anymore. My name is Miss Marple," she said gently. "I'm visiting Much Ellering, and I've heard about your case. I wonder if you would mind answering a few questions." His face closed immediately, taking on the weary blankness of one who had been disappointed too many times to hope for anything better. "I've told my story 100 times. Nobody believed it then. I don't suppose you will either." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple said, "I should like to hear it. Sometimes a fresh ear catches what others have missed." He studied her for a long moment, and she met his gaze steadily. Whatever he saw there seemed to decide him, for his shoulders relaxed fractionally. "I was Mrs. Olcott's gardener," he began. "I'd been for near 10 years. She was a good employer, fair-minded, never complained if the weather was against me or—" if something took longer than expected. I was at the house that day, the day she died, working on the rose beds. It was cold, bitter cold, and she'd had me come in around 3 for a cup of tea to warm myself. That was kind of her. She was kind. That's what makes this so hard to bear, miss, that people think I could have hurt her. His voice cracked slightly. I left her alive and well at 4. She said she had an appointment that evening, and I should come back the next morning to finish the work. An appointment with whom? She didn't say, and I didn't ask. Wasn't my place to pry. He rubbed his face wearily. But when I came back the next day, there were police everywhere. She'd been found by the cleaning woman, strangled with a length of cord from her own curtain tie. And because I'd been the last person known to be there because my fingerprints were all over the house from years of working there, they decided I'd done it. Miss Marple considered this carefully. You said you were the last person known to be there. Do you believe someone else came after you left? I'm certain of it, miss. His hands clenched on the table. There was someone else in the house when I left. I heard voices from the drawing room as I was going out the back. Wait, Mrs. Olcott's voice and a man's. She sounded upset, frightened even, though she was trying not to show. But you didn't see this person? No, miss. The drawing room door was closed, and I thought it best not to intrude. But I heard enough to know it was someone she knew, someone she'd let in willingly. What makes you think she was frightened? Reed's eyes grew distant with memory. She had a way of speaking when she was nervous, quick-like, with pauses between her words. My wife used to do the same when the doctor came about her boy's fever. Some people get loud when they're scared. Some get quiet and careful, Miss Marple nodded. She had observed the same phenomenon many times. Fear expressed itself in peculiar ways, and those who knew a person well could often detect it when strangers missed it entirely. Was anything mentioned at your trial about this visitor? I told the police, told my solicitor, told the court, but there was no evidence anyone else had been there. No strange fingerprints, nothing disturbed. They said I was making it up, trying to shift blame. His voice had grown bitter. The prosecution said I'd gone back later after dark and forced my way in. They said there had been an argument about money, that I'd been stealing from her and she'd found out. And had you? No, miss. He met her eyes directly. I never took so much as a sprig of parsley from that garden without asking. My father raised me honest, and I stayed honest, even when times were hard. Miss Marple believed him. She had encountered many liars in her long life, and this man lacked the tells that usually accompanied falsehood. No excessive detail. No over-protestation of innocence, just a quiet, weary honesty. Did Mrs. Olcott ever mention a business associate of her late husband's? A Mr. Gerald Partridge? The effect of the name was immediate and striking. Reed sat up straighter, his eyes widening. Partridge, he repeated. Yes, miss. He'd been to the house several times over the years. Mrs. Olcott never seemed easy when he called. Always dismissed me early on those days. Said she wanted privacy for her business discussions. Did she ever speak of him to you? Only once. It was perhaps a month before she died. I was pruning near the drawing room window and I heard her on the telephone. She was saying something about having had enough, that I couldn't threaten her anymore, that she'd kept quiet long enough but she wouldn't be bullied. Reed leaned forward. Then she said his name clear as day. Mr. Partridge, you'll get nothing more from me. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. And did you tell the police this? I did, miss, but Mr. Partridge was a respected gentleman, a man of property and good reputation. My word against his was no word at all. They said I'd misheard or made it up to implicate an innocent man. He paused. Besides, he'd left much Ellering by the time the trial came up. Gone to live somewhere near London, they said. The police questioned him, but he had an alibi for the evening. Said he'd been dining at his club with several witnesses. The evening. but not the afternoon. Reed's eyes sharpened with something like hope. That's right, miss. He said he'd left Much Ellering in the morning and gone straight to London. Botalibus can be arranged, can't they? Especially for a man with money and connections. They can indeed. Miss Marple rose, gathering her gloves. Mr. Reed, I wonder if you would do something for me. Would you write down everything you remember about that afternoon? Every detail, no matter how small it seems. The time you arrived, the time you left, what Mrs. Olcott said, what you heard from the drawing room, everything. Do you think it will help, miss? His voice was cautious, afraid to hope too openly. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that the truth has a way of emerging given the proper attention. And I believe that what you've told me today is the truth. His eyes filled suddenly, and he looked away, struggling for composure. Thank you, miss. You don't know what it means, having someone believe me, just to have someone listen. I shall do more than listen, Mr. Reed, I'll do my very best to help you. As Miss Marple left the prison and climbed into the hired car that would take her back to Much Ellering, she reviewed what she had learned. A mysterious visitor on the day of the murder. A man Mrs. Olcott feared. A connection to Gerald Partridge that the police had dismissed too easily. And most telling of all, that telephone conversation overheard by the gardener. Someone had been threatening Mrs. Olcott. Someone she had finally decided to defy. And that someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, was not the gentle-voiced man who now sat in a prison cell for a crime he did not commit. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Schoolyard. Miss Marple had learned long ago that villages were rather like spiderwebs. Touch one thread, and the whole structure trembled, carrying information from one corner to another with remarkable speed. By the time she returned from her visit to the prison, Much Ellering was already humming with speculation about the elderly lady who'd gone to see the murderer. Mrs. Harper had been distressed to discover Miss Marple's destination, though she tried to hide it behind flutterings about the impropriety of such an expedition and concerns for Miss Marple's safety. Really, Miss Marple, I don't know what you can have been thinking. A prison is no place for a lady of your standing, and to visit that man of all people. I found him quite harmless, Miss Marple said mildly, pouring herself a cup of tea. In fact, I found him rather convincing in his protestations of innocence. Mrs. Harper's teacup rattled in its saucer. But he was tried and convicted. Surely you don't believe he's innocent. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that innocent men are sometimes convicted and guilty men sometimes walk free. It's an unfortunate truth about human justice. She had decided it was time to venture into the village proper and see what information might be gleaned from those who had lived through the events 3 years ago. A casual walk, perhaps a visit to the shops, and certainly a stop at the church to admire the architecture. In Miss Marple's experience, one learned a great deal by appearing to be merely a curious visitor with time on her hands. The village high street was modest but well kept, with a butcher, a baker, a general store that seemed to sell everything from stamps to saucepans, and a tea room with lace curtains in the windows. Miss Marple made her way slowly, observing as much as she was observed. The schoolmistress, a spare woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, was just emerging from the post office as Miss Marple passed. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "What a charming village you have here." "Thank you." "You must be Mrs. Harper's guest," the schoolmistress smiled. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm Elena Pritchard. I teach at the village school." "How nice to meet you." Miss Marple fell into step beside her. "I've always admired teachers. Such an important profession, shaping young minds. It has its rewards." Miss Pritchard's expression suggested it also had considerable challenges. though children nowadays seem to know rather more than one might wish. They pick up things from all quarters. Indeed, they do. I've noticed that Mrs. Harper's granddaughter is quite observant for her age. Something flickered across Miss Pritchard's face. Little Daisy. Yes, she's a bright child, too bright, perhaps, for her own comfort. She asks questions that make adults uncomfortable. They had reached the school, a stone building set back from the road with a small playground where several children were engaged in a game of hopscotch during their lunch break. Miss Marple paused to watch them, and as she did, she heard a curious thing. 3 girls were jumping rope in the far corner, chanting as they skipped. The words were difficult to make out at first, but as Miss Marple listened more carefully, she caught the rhythm of the verse. Red hands. Partridge hides in the lane. Red hands, Partridge won't come again. He did a bad thing. He won't confess. Red hands, Partridge in his Sunday dress. Miss Marple felt a small shock of recognition. Children's rhymes often preserved old stories, passing them down through generations long after adults had forgotten or chosen to forget. What an unusual skipping song, she remarked to Miss Pritchard. The schoolmistress's face had gone quite pale. I've tried to discourage it, she said. It started up again about 6 months ago. I have no idea where they learned it, but it refers to the Olcott case, surely. Miss Pritchard glanced around nervously. Perhaps we might walk a bit further. I'd rather not discuss such things within earshot of the children. They moved away from the school, following a path that led past the church and toward a small green where a memorial to the war dead stood surrounded by chrysanthemums. That rhyme has been around for years, Miss Pritchard said quietly. Or rather, versions of it have. It started shortly after Mrs. Olcott's death. The children picked it up somehow, though I never learned from where. It died out after Henry Reed's conviction. But then this spring it started again. Different words, but the same theme. Red hands, Partridge, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Not Red hands, Reed. Precisely. Which is why I found it so disturbing. Miss Pritchard stopped walking and turned to face Miss Marple directly. You've been asking questions about the case. Mrs. Harper mentioned it at church last Sunday, with some concern. May I ask why you're interested? Because I believe an innocent man may be in prison, Miss Marple said simply. And because a child has spoken a truth that adults are determined to ignore. Miss Pritchard nodded slowly. Daisy? Yes, I thought it might be that. She's enrolled to start at my school after Christmas, and Mrs. Harper came to speak with me about her. Said the child had peculiar fancies and mustn't be encouraged in them. Do you know anything about her nurse? Nanny Oakes? A little. She's Mrs. Harper's cousin's daughter or some such connection. Came to the household this spring when Daisy's mother needed someone reliable. Before that, she was in service with a family in the next county. Miss Pritchard paused. I believe she had a connection to Gerald Partridge's sister, though I can't recall the details. That's very interesting. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. And Mr. Partridge himself, what was he like? I knew him only slightly. He was a prosperous man, always well-dressed, rather fond of his own consequence. He and Mr. Olcott had been in business together, something to do with property investments. After Mr. Olcott's death, there was some talk that the partnership hadn't ended as amicably as it might have done, financial difficulties possibly. Mrs. Olcott was not as wealthy as people assumed. The house was mortgaged, I believe, and there were debts. Mr. Partridge called on her several times in the months before her death. Miss Pritchard lowered her voice. My parlor-maid's sister worked as Mrs. Olcott's cleaning woman. She said Mrs. Olcott always seemed upset after Mr. Partridge's visits. Did this cleaning woman testify at the trial? She did, but only about finding the body. The police weren't interested in her opinions about Mr. Partridge's visits. They had their man in Henry Reed, and that was sufficient for them. Miss Marple watched the children playing in the distance, their voices carrying on the autumn breeze. The girls with the skipping rope had been joined by others, and the chant about Red Hand's partridge rose and fell like a ghostly accusation. "Children often know more than we credit them with," Miss Marple said. "They see things clearly without the filters of politeness and social convention that cloud adult vision." "That's what troubles me," Miss Pritchard admitted. "If children have been saying this for 3 years, where did they learn it? Someone must have spoken of it, must have planted the seed of the story. Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "someone saw something and told another child, and that child told another, until it became a rhyme that preserved the truth when adults refused to acknowledge it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ordinary scene of village children at play. But Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. Nanny Oaksworth, her connection to Partridge's family, the children's rhyme that had persisted despite official certainty of Reed's guilt, the financial troubles between Mrs. Olcott and her late husband's partner, and always at the center of it all, a small child who remembered red gloves and a man in a garden on a winter's day. "Thank you for speaking with me so frankly, Miss Pritchard," Miss Marple said. "You've been most helpful." "I hope you can help Henry Reed," the schoolmistress replied. "I never believed he did it, you know. He was too gentle a soul, but justice isn't always just, is it?" "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "But sometimes with patience and attention, it can be set right." As she made her way back to Mrs. Harper's house, Miss Marple found herself humming the children's rhyme under her breath. Red Hands, Partridge, the name that would not die, preserved in the innocent voices of those too young to understand the weight of what they sang. Someone in Much Ellering knew the truth, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Chapter 6. A Visit to Mrs. Olcott's House. The old house stood at the end of Bramble Lane, set back from the road behind an overgrown hedge that had once been neatly trimmed. Miss Marple approached it on Saturday morning, having learned from the postmaster that the property was now let to a Mrs. Clement, a widow who had taken up residence only 3 months previously. The garden showed signs of Henry Reed's last attentions, still visible beneath 3 years of neglect. The rosebeds he'd mentioned were choked with weeds, but their original layout was discernible to one who knew gardens. And Miss Marple, having spent a lifetime in the pursuit of horticultural excellence, knew gardens very well indeed. The apple tree Daisy had drawn stood near the back gate, its branches heavy with unpicked fruit. Miss Marple paused to study it, noting the distinctive twisted trunk and the way it leaned slightly toward the house as though listening. Children noticed such things. They remembered trees that seemed alive, watching. A nervous voice called from the doorway. "May I help you?" Mrs. Clement proved to be a small, mousy woman in her 50s, with the apologetic manner of someone who expected to be imposed upon and had long since ceased resisting. She wore an old cardigan, despite the relative mildness of the day, and her hands twisted together as she spoke. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said warmly. "My name is Miss Marple. I'm visiting the village, and I have rather a passion for old houses. I wondered if you might permit me to look around. I understand this house has quite a history." Mrs. Clement's face registered alarm followed by resignation. "You mean because of the murder? Everyone wants to know about that. The estate agent didn't tell me at first, and when I found out, well, I'd already signed the lease." She stepped back from the door. "You might as well come in. Most people do one way or another." The interior of the house was shabby but genteel, with good bones beneath the worn furnishings. Mrs. Clement had done her best with cheap cushions and throws, but there was no disguising the fact that the place had an atmosphere of lingering unhappiness. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said sympathetically, "living in a house where such a tragedy occurred." I don't mind the ghost, if there is one, Mrs. Clement said with unexpected spirit. Mrs. Olcott, if she walks, has every right to. It's the living who bother me. People peering through the windows, children daring each other to touch the gate, and the questions, always the questions. I apologize for adding to your burden, but I have a particular interest in the case. I believe the wrong man may have been convicted. Mrs. Clement looked at her sharply. Do you now? Well, you're not the first to think it. The cleaning woman who found the body, Mrs. Doris, she lives in the cottage at the end of the lane. She told me she never believed it was Henry Reed. Said he was a gentle soul who wouldn't hurt a fly. May I look around? I promise not to disturb anything. Mrs. Clement shrugged. Help yourself. The parlor's through there. That's where she was found, they said, strangled with a curtain cord. The parlor was a pleasant room with windows overlooking the garden. The furniture was different now, Mrs. Clement's own pieces, but Miss Marple could imagine how it had been. She moved slowly around the space, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The wallpaper was old, a faded pattern of roses. And there, above the mantelpiece, was what she had hoped to find. A rectangular patch where the paper was slightly less faded, the outline of a picture frame that had once hung there. A small nail remained driven into the plaster. Was there a picture here when you moved in? Miss Marple asked. No. The house was empty. The family took everything after the trial, sold what they could, I suppose. Miss Marple drew closer, examining the space behind where the frame would have hung. The wallpaper had pulled slightly away from the wall in one corner, and there was a narrow gap between paper and plaster. She reached up carefully, her fingers probing the space. What are you doing? Mrs. Clement asked, alarmed. Just a moment. Miss Marple's fingers closed on something. She drew out a piece of paper, brittle and yellowed, folded into a small square. How very interesting. She unfolded it with care. The paper was expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence. The writing was in a masculine hand, strong and self-assured. Only a fragment remained, the top portion of what had clearly been a longer letter. The words were few but significant. She must never speak of it again. The matter is closed, and any attempt to revisit. The signature at the bottom read simply, G.P. Miss Marple felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Clement, would you mind very much if I kept this? It may be important. Keep it and welcome. I want nothing from this house except the roof over my head until I can find somewhere else. Mrs. Clement hugged herself. Is it evidence? Will it help that poor man in prison? It may indeed. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and placed it in her handbag. You've been most kind. One more question, if I may. Have you noticed anything unusual since you've been here? Anything that struck you as odd? Mrs. Clement considered this. There was one thing. Shortly after I moved in, a man came round asking if he could look through the attic. Said he'd stored some papers there years ago and wanted to retrieve them. I told him the house had been cleared out, but he was quite insistent. Got rather angry when I wouldn't let him in. Did he give his name? He said it was Grayson, Mr. Grayson. He had a London accent, well-dressed, but there was something about him I didn't like. Cold eyes, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple knew exactly what she meant. Can you describe him? Tall, perhaps 60 years old, gray hair, very well kept, expensive coat, and he wore gloves, even though it wasn't particularly cold. Red leather gloves, rather distinctive. The air in the parlor seemed suddenly charged. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, arranging themselves into a clearer pattern. When was this? About a month ago. He came twice, actually. The second time he offered me money, said the papers were important business documents. I told him I'd already searched the attic myself, and there was nothing there but old trunks and dust. You were quite right to refuse him, Miss Marple said firmly. Did he say anything else? Only that if I found anything, any papers or letters, I should burn them immediately. Said they were private matters that should stay buried. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. You don't think he was the one who killed Mrs. Olcott? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Grayson, whoever Hetreley is, has something to hide. And I think he's afraid that evidence of his guilt may still exist somewhere in this house. She looked again at the fragment of letter in her hand. She must never speak of it again. What had Mrs. Olcott known? What secret had she threatened to reveal? And had that threat cost her her life? As Miss Marple took her leave of Mrs. Clement, she paused by the apple tree, looking up through its branches at the house. A child had seen a man with red gloves leaving this garden 3 years ago, and now a man with red gloves had returned, desperate to find and destroy evidence of his crime. The truth was emerging as Miss Marple had known it would, like a body rising to the surface of still water. It could be hidden only so long before it must appear. She had work to do and not much time to do it. Chapter 7. The Hidden Sketch. Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Harper's house to find an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension. Mrs. Harper herself was in the drawing room, speaking in low, urgent tones to Nanny Oakes, and both women fell silent the moment Miss Marple appeared in the doorway. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harper said, her voice artificially bright. "We were just discussing Daisy. She's been rather unsettled today." "Nothing serious, I hope." "Just childish fancies." Nanny Oakes's tone was clipped. "She's been drawing again, obsessively. The same picture over and over. I've told her it's not healthy." Miss Marple felt a prickle of concern. "May I see her? I really don't think—" Nanny Oakes began, but Mrs. Harper interrupted. "Perhaps it would be best. You have a way with her, Miss Marple. She seems to trust you." The nurse's expression suggested this was not a desirable state of affairs, but she said nothing more, merely stepping aside to allow Miss Marple to pass. Daisy was in the nursery, sitting at her small table with papers scattered around her. The child looked up as Miss Marple entered, and there was something in her eyes that struck Miss Marple as deeply troubling, a kind of haunted awareness that no 5-year-old should possess. "Hello, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in the chair beside the table. "I hear you've been drawing." "I can't stop," Daisy said, her voice small and frightened. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The garden, the tree, and the man with red hands." "And the lady?" Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "The lady? You've drawn a lady?" Daisy nodded and pushed one of the papers toward her. Miss Marple picked it up and felt a cold shock of recognition. The drawing was more detailed than Daisy's previous efforts, executed with a strange precision that seemed beyond her years. It showed the old garden with unmistakable accuracy, the apple tree with its twisted trunk, the gate, the back of the house with its distinctive bay window. And there, rendered in careful strokes, were 2 figures, a man in a dark suit with bright red hands, and a woman in a long dress standing near the tree. The woman's face bore an expression that the child had somehow managed to capture despite her limited artistic skills, an expression of fear. "This is remarkable, Daisy," Miss Marple said quietly. "Where did you see this?" "In your memory?" "I don't know." The child's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember seeing it, but I know it's true." "Does that make sense?" "More sense than you might imagine." Miss Marple studied the other drawings scattered across the table. They were variations on the same theme, each one showing slightly different details. In one, the man was closer to the woman. In another, his hands were reaching toward her. In a third, the woman was falling, and the man was turning away toward the gate. "Daisy," Miss Marple said carefully, "have you been having dreams about this?" "Not dreams exactly. More like pictures in my head that won't go away." The child wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Nanny says I'm making myself ill with imagination. But I'm not imagining it, Miss Marple. I know I'm not. Miss Marple gathered the drawings together and studied them more closely. The detail was extraordinary. The apple tree was drawn exactly as it appeared in reality, down to the peculiar bend in one of the lower branches. The gate had the correct number of palings. Even the bay window was positioned accurately. How do you know what this garden looks like? Miss Marple asked. Have you been to the old cot house? No, I just know. Daisy's voice was desperate now. Just like I know about the dollhouse. It belonged to someone who lived in the house, didn't it? Someone who saw something terrible. Miss Marple felt ackle run down her spine. She thought of the wooden figure with red hands, the label marked Mr. P, and the fragment of a child's message hidden in the doll's lining. Was it possible that Daisy, in playing with these toys, had somehow absorbed the memories they contained? Or was there something more at work here, some connection she had yet to understand? Daisy, she said gently, I want you to tell me something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Has anyone told you about what happened in that garden? Anyone at all? The child shook her head. Nanny talks sometimes about Mrs. Olcott and how the wrong man went to prison. But she's never told me what happened. She just says it was very sad and very wrong. And the drawings? When did you start making them? After I found the little man in the dollhouse, the one with red hands. After that, I started seeing the pictures in my head. Daisy looked down at her hands. Am I going mad, Miss Marple? Like the lady in the story Nanny read me, who saw things that weren't there? No, my dear, you're not going mad. Miss Marple took the child's hand in her own. I think you're remembering something important, something that someone else saw and tried to preserve in her own way. She thought of Mrs. Olcott's daughter, Caroline, who had owned the dollhouse. What had that child witnessed? Had she seen the murder itself or only the aftermath? And had she created the little figure with red hands as a way of holding on to the truth when the adults around her refused to believe what she said? May I keep these drawings? Miss Marple asked. Daisy nodded, relief flooding her face. I don't want to look at them anymore. They frighten me. That's very brave of you. Miss Marple gathered the papers carefully. But Daisy, I want you to promise me something. If you remember anything else, any other detail, you must tell me immediately. Can you do that? Yes, Miss Marple. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Daisy spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. The lady in the drawing, she was trying to get away from him. He was angry about something, and she was frightened. I can feel it, Miss Marple, her fear. Miss Marple paused at the door. I believe you can, my dear. And I believe that by remembering, you're helping her to have justice at last. She left the nursery and descended the stairs, the drawings held carefully against her chest. In the hallway, she encountered Mrs. Harper, who was hovering anxiously. Is she all right? Nanny Oakes says she's been having nightmares. She's troubled, Miss Marple said, and with good reason. Mrs. Harper, I must ask you something directly. How well did you know Mrs. Olcott? Mrs. Harper's face paled. I knew her slightly. We weren't close friends, but one knows everyone in a village. And her daughter Caroline. Did you know her? She left the village when she married, years before the tragedy. I never met her. Miss Marple studied her hostess carefully. The dollhouse that Daisy plays with. You said it came from a church sale after Mrs. Olcott's death. Did you know it had belonged to Caroline Olcott? I suppose I must have known. But it was just a toy, Miss Marple. I never thought, Mrs. Harper's voice trailed off. Never thought what? That it would matter. That it would stir up old memories, old fears. Mrs. Harper sank into a chair in the hallway, her composure crumbling. I should never have bought it. I should have known better. Miss Marple regarded her with compassion, but also with determination. I think, Mrs. Harper, that it's time you told me everything you know about the Olcott case. Everything you've been too frightened to say." The older woman's hands twisted in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then finally she looked up, and her eyes were full of tears. "Very well," she whispered, "but not here. Not where Nanny Oakes might hear." Chapter 8. The House Beyond the Meadow. They sat in Mrs. Harper's private sitting room, a small chamber at the back of the house that Miss Marple had not seen before. It had the feel of a retreat, a place where one went to escape the demands of household and guests. Mrs. Harper closed the door firmly and stood for a moment with her back to it, as though gathering courage. "I have carried this burden for 3 years," she said finally. "I told myself it was none of my business, that the police had made their decision, and I had no right to interfere. But it has weighed on me, Miss Marple. It has weighed on me terribly." "The truth often does," Miss Marple said gently, "when we try to bury it. But it's not too late to speak." Mrs. Harper moved to the window looking out over the garden, where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. "I knew Gerald Partridge," she said. "Not well, but better than I admitted. He was my late husband's cousin. Distant family, but family nonetheless." Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle sliding into place. "I see. And you felt loyalty prevented you from speaking against him." "It was more than loyalty. It was fear." Mrs. Harper turned from the window, her face drawn. "Gerald Partridge is not a man one crosses lightly. He has money, influence, and a ruthless streak that he hides beneath a veneer of respectability. When the police decided it was Henry Reed, Gerald made it very clear to anyone who might have thought otherwise that it was better to remain silent." "He threatened you?" "Not directly. He came to see me shortly after the trial, ostensibly to pay a social call, but his message was clear. He spoke of how unfortunate it would be if unfounded rumors circulated, how reputations could be destroyed by careless talk, how even the innocent could suffer if unproven accusations were made." Mrs. Harper's voice trembled. "He mentioned my son, who was hoping for a position in the civil service. He made it clear that one word from him could ruin my son's prospects." "So you said nothing?" "I said nothing. And I have hated myself for it ever since." Mrs. Harper sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older. "But I didn't know anything for certain, you see, only suspicions, only fragments of things I'd heard or observed." "Tell me what you know," Miss Marple urged. "Even fragments can form a pattern." Mrs. Harper took a deep breath. Gerald and Mrs. Olcott's late husband had been in business together. Property investments, mostly. When Mr. Olcott died quite suddenly 5 years ago, there were irregularities in the accounts. Nothing that could be proven, but whispers that Gerald had been less than honest in his dealings. Mrs. Olcott had begun asking questions, demanding to see records. She believed Gerald had cheated her husband and was continuing to appropriate funds that should have come to her. She threatened to expose him. More than that, she said, she had proof, papers that her husband had kept, showing that Gerald had been embezzling from their partnership for years. Mrs. Harper's hands clenched in her lap. "I heard her say as much at a church committee meeting. She was angry, rightfully so, and she said she'd kept quiet long enough, but she wouldn't bezzle anymore." "And Gerald Partridge heard this?" "He wasn't there, but word travels in a village. Someone would have told him, and within a fortnight Mrs. Olcott was dead." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "You said you had suspicions. Was there something else? Something you saw or heard?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The day Mrs. Olcott died, I was walking back from the village in the late afternoon. It was bitterly cold, as you know, and growing dark early. As I passed the lane that leads to the old cot house, I saw a motor car parked at the corner, a large, expensive car, and standing beside it, putting on his driving gloves, was Gerald Partridge. What time was this? Perhaps 5 or nearing 6 o'clock. He saw me and called out a greeting. Said he'd been paying a call on Mrs. Olcott to discuss some business matter. He seemed perfectly composed, but there was something in his manner that struck me as wrong. Too casual, too unconcerned. Mrs. Harper's voice dropped. His gloves were red leather, very distinctive. I remember thinking how odd it was to change gloves on such a cold day, as though the ones he'd been wearing had become unsuitable somehow. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Here was independent confirmation of what Daisy had seen, what Henry Reed had overheard, what the children's rhyme had preserved, a man with red gloves leaving the old house at the very time the murder must have occurred. Did you tell the police this? I tried, Mrs. Harper said miserably. I went to the station the next day after they'd arrested Henry Reed, but the inspector was dismissive. He said Gerald had already provided an alibi, that he'd been seen at his London club that evening by multiple witnesses. My timing must have been mistaken, he said, or I'd confused the day. He made me feel foolish, as though I were a hysterical woman seeing phantoms. But you're certain of what you saw? As certain as I can be. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind, wondering if I could have been mistaken. But no, Miss Marple, it was Gerald Partridge. It was that day and it was at that time. Miss Marple rose and began to pace, her mind working rapidly. An alibi for the evening, but not for the late afternoon. A man seen leaving the scene at the crucial time. Financial motive. Threats to silence witnesses. And now, 3 years later, that same man returning in disguise, desperate to retrieve evidence that might still condemn him. Mrs. Harper, she said, you mentioned that Gerald Partridge left much Ellering after the trial. Do you know where he went? He took a house somewhere near London. I heard he'd changed his name or was using an alias. Wanted to start fresh, away from the scandal. Mrs. Harper looked up hopefully. Why do you ask? Because I believe I may have found him. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Clement's description of the man who had come seeking papers in the old cot house, Mr. Grayson, with his cold eyes and his distinctive red gloves. And I believe he's grown desperate enough to risk returning. She moved to the window and looked out at the peaceful garden, thinking. The time had come to act, but she must be careful. A man who had killed once and framed an innocent person would not hesitate to kill again if he felt cornered. I need to know where Gerald Partridge is living now, she said. Is there anyone who might have that information? Mrs. Harper considered this. His sister, perhaps, Agnes Partridge, though she married and is now Mrs. Fordyce. She lives in the next county, in Little Wythorn. They were close, she and Gerald. She visited Much Ellering once or twice after the trial, made a point of defending her brother's character. Little Wythorn, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Something stirred in her memory. Mrs. Harper, you said earlier that Nanny Oakes had a connection to Gerald Partridge's sister. What exactly was that connection? Oh, I believe she was in service to Mrs. Fordyce some years ago, before she came to me at any rate. Why do you ask? Miss Marple felt the final pieces falling into place. Nanny Oakes, who had worked for Partridge's sister, who had been in Much Ellering on the day of the murder, walking with Daisy in her pram past the old cot house, who had seen Eamon with red gloves and had told the child years later that the wrong man had been punished. I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that Nanny Oakes may be the key to this entire mystery. She knows more than she said. Perhaps she's been protecting someone, or perhaps she's been afraid. But she was there, Mrs. Harper. She saw what Daisy saw, and she's been trying in her limited way to preserve that truth. But why wouldn't she have gone to the police? For the same reason you didn't, fear of Gerald Partridge and what he might do. Miss Marple turned from the window. I need to visit Little Wythorn. Tomorrow, if possible. Will you help me find the exact location of Mrs. Fortis's house?
I can do better than that. I have the address somewhere in my correspondence.
Mrs. Harper rose with new purpose. Miss Marple, do you truly think you can prove Henry Reed's innocence? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that I'm very close to having all the evidence I need. One more piece, one more confirmation, and the pattern will be complete. That evening, after dinner, Miss Marple sat in her room and reviewed everything she had learned. The fragment of letter signed G.P., the wooden figure with red hands, Daisy's drawings and her inexplicable knowledge of the old cot garden, Henry Reed's testimony about a visitor in the house, the children's rhyme that had preserved the truth, Mrs. Harper's sighting of Partridge at the crucial time, and now the connection through Nanny Oakes to Partridge's sister. It was all there, woven together like one of her embroidery patterns. But she needed one more thread to make it hold, one piece of evidence that would be incontrovertible. She thought of the village of Little Withorn, where Gerald Partridge now lived under an assumed name, a village with an orchard, according to Miss Pritchard. And somewhere in that orchard, if Daisy's strange visions were accurate, an apple tree very like the one in the old garden. Tomorrow she would go there. Tomorrow she would confront the man who had killed Mrs. Olcott and let an innocent man take the blame. And tomorrow, if her suspicions were correct, justice would finally begin to emerge from 3 years of darkness. Chapter 9. The Name in the Doll's Dress. Miss Marple's journey to Little Wythorn was delayed by a most unexpected development. She had risen early on Sunday morning, intending to make her excuses to Mrs. Harper and take the train immediately after breakfast. But before she could even descend the stairs, Daisy appeared at her bedroom door, her face pale and her eyes wide with urgency. "Miss Marple," the child whispered, "I found something. Something important. What is it, my dear?" "In the dollhouse, in the big doll, the lady doll, there's something hidden inside her dress." Miss Marple felt her heart quicken. "Show me." They went together to the nursery, moving quietly so as not to wake Nanny Oakes, whose room was adjacent. The dollhouse stood where it always did, and Daisy reached inside to extract a porcelain doll dressed in Victorian clothing. The doll was perhaps 6 inches tall, beautifully crafted, with a cloth body and delicate painted features. "I was changing her dress," Daisy explained in a whisper. "The old one was torn, and when I took it off, I felt something in the lining, something crinkly like paper." Miss Marple took the doll with careful hands. The dress was indeed torn along one seam, and as she examined it closely, she could feel something concealed within the fabric. With Daisy watching intently, she carefully unpicked the stitching that held the lining in place. A small piece of paper fell out, folded many times to make it as small as possible. Miss Marple unfolded it with trembling fingers. The writing was in pencil, faded but still legible, a child's handwriting, painstakingly careful, as though the writer had known the importance of what she was recording. "Mr. P. hurt Mommy. I saw him, red gloves. He was angry and Mommy was scared. I hid, but I saw. Nobody believes me. They say I dreamed it. I'm writing this so I won't forget. Caroline Olcott, age 8. Miss Marple read it twice, then looked at Daisy, whose eyes were round with understanding beyond her years. "She saw it too," Daisy said softly. "Just like I did, the man with the red gloves hurting the lady." "Yes, my dear." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Caroline Olcott witnessed her mother's murder, and when the adults wouldn't believe her, she wrote it down and hid it where she thought it would be safe." "Why didn't they believe her?" "Because adults often make the mistake of thinking children don't understand what they see. Or they convince themselves that a child's testimony is unreliable, especially when it conflicts with what they want to believe." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "But you believed your own memory, Daisy? Even when others told you it was imagination?" and that's been very brave indeed." The child looked down at the doll in Miss Marple's hands. "Will this help the gardener, the one who didn't do it?" "I believe it will help very much indeed." A sound at the door made them both turn. Nanny Oakes stood there, still in her dressing gown, her face stricken. "You found it," she said, "and it was not a question." "You knew it was there," Miss Marple replied. "It was not a question either." Nanny Oakes entered the room and closed the door behind her. She seemed to have aged years in a moment, all the stiffness gone from her bearing. "Not at first. Not when I gave Mrs. Harper the dollhouse to buy for Daisy. I'd taken it from Mrs. Fordyce's attic, where it had been stored for years. Mrs. Fordyce had been Caroline, Olcott's godmother, and had kept some of her things after the tragedy. But you discovered the message later. I saw Daisy playing with the doll on a day, and something about the way she was examining it made me look more carefully myself. I found the torn seam and felt the paper inside." Nanny sank into a chair. "I couldn't bring myself to take it out. I told myself it was better left hidden, that enough damage had been done already. Yet you told Daisy that the wrong man had been punished. I couldn't help myself." The nurse's voice broke. "I was there that day, Miss Marple. I was pushing Daisy in her pram, and I saw Gerald Partridge leaving the old house. I saw his face, his red gloves, the way he looked around to see if anyone was watching, and I saw something else." "What did you see?" "Mrs. Olcott's face at the window, just for a moment before he came out. She looked terrified, and then she was gone, and he came through the gate, and he walked past me as though I were invisible, as though servants and children didn't matter, didn't count." Miss Marple understood then the full weight of what Nanny Oakes had carried. "You were afraid to speak. Mrs. Fordyce is my employer's sister. Gerald Partridge is her brother. When Henry Reed was arrested, I thought about going to the police, but Mrs. Fordyce heard the rumors and made it clear what would happen if anyone in her household spoke against her brother. I would lose my position, my references, everything." Nanny Oakes looked at Daisy with anguish. "But I couldn't let the truth die completely. So I told this child, thinking perhaps someday she would understand, someday it would matter. And it does matter," Miss Marple said firmly. "It matters now." She held up the paper with Caroline Olcott's message. "This, combined with everything else I've gathered, will be enough. Enough to reopen the case. Enough to free Henry Reed. Enough to bring Gerald Partridge to justice." "He'll deny it," Nanny Oakes said. "He'll say it's a child's fantasy, just as they said about Caroline. But now we have two children's testimonies, separated by years but describing the same scene. We have your testimony as an adult witness. We have Mrs. Harper's sighting of him at the scene. We have the fragment of his threatening letter, and we have the wooden figure from the dollhouse marked with his initial." Miss Marple's voice was still, beneath the gentleness. "Most importantly, we have proof that he's been desperate enough to return to the scene trying to destroy evidence. That desperation will be his undoing." She looked at the nurse steadily. "But I will need you to testify, Nanny Oakes. I will need you to be brave enough to tell what you saw." Nanny Oakes met her gaze and slowly, painfully, she nodded. "I will. God help me, I will. I should have done it 3 years ago." "You're doing it now," Miss Marple said. "That's what matters." She turned to Daisy and knelt beside her chair. "And you, my dear child, have done something extraordinary. You've helped uncover a truth that might have stayed hidden forever." Daisy looked at the doll, then at Miss Marple. "Will Caroline know that someone finally listened?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that somehow she will." Chapter 10. Truth Beneath the Apple Tree. Inspector Davies of Scotland Yard arrived in Much Ellering on Monday afternoon, accompanied by a local constable and an air of professional skepticism that Miss Marple had encountered many times before. He was a solid, methodical man in his 50s, with the sort of face that suggested he had heard every unlikely theory and fantastic claim that the public could devise. Miss Marple received him in Mrs. Harper's drawing room, with Mrs. Harper herself present along with Nanny Oakes, who sat pale and rigid in a chair by the window. On the table between them lay the evidence Miss Marple had assembled, the wooden figure with red painted hands, the label marked Mr. P. Caroline Olcott's hidden message, the fragment of letter signed GP, and Daisy's drawings. "I understand you believe Henry Reed was wrongly convicted," Inspector Davies said, his tone suggesting he had heard this before and had been disappointed. "I know he was wrongly convicted," Miss Marple replied calmly, "and I can prove it." She proceeded to lay out the case with the same methodical precision the inspector himself might have used. She began with Daisy's statement at the tea table, explained the significance of the dollhouse and its contents, detailed Henry Reed's testimony about a mysterious visitor, and described the children's rhyme that had preserved the truth when adults refused to acknowledge it. "Circumstantial," the inspector said when she paused. "Interesting, certainly, but hardly conclusive. Then perhaps this will be more persuasive." Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Harper, who took a deep breath and recounted her sighting of Gerald Partridge leaving the Olcott house at the crucial time. "Why didn't you come forward at the time?" Inspector Davies asked, his tone sharpening. "Because I was frightened," Mrs. Harper said simply, "and because the police had already decided it was Henry Reed." "And you, Miss Oakes, you claim you saw this man as well?" Nanny Oakes's voice was steady, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I saw Gerald Partridge leaving the Olcott house at approximately 5 on the day of the murder. He was wearing red leather gloves. I saw Mrs. Olcott's face at the window moments before, and she looked terrified. I was pushing a pram with Ichilde, and I saw everything clearly." "Why didn't you testify?" "For the same reason Mrs. Harper didn't. Fear of Mr. Partridge, and fear for my livelihood. I was employed by his sister at the time." She met his gaze directly. "I was wrong to remain silent." "I know that now." Inspector Davies made notes, his expression unreadable. "These are serious allegations. Gerald Partridge had an alibi for that evening." "But not for the late afternoon," Miss Marple pointed out. "And I believe if you investigate, you'll find that his alibi was arranged. Perhaps his companions at the club were mistaken about the time he arrived. Or perhaps they were persuaded to be less than truthful. A man with money and influence can accomplish a great deal. You mentioned evidence that he's been attempting to destroy proof of his guilt. He's been to the old house twice in the past month using the name Grayson, attempting to retrieve papers he fears will incriminate him." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Inspector, a man who returns to the scene of his crime after 3 years, desperate to find evidence, is a man who knows that evidence exists. That alone should warrant investigation." The inspector studied the items on the table, then looked at Caroline Olcott's message. This was written by Mrs. Olcott's daughter 20 years ago when she was 8 years old. She witnessed her mother's murder and tried to tell the adults, but they dismissed it as a child's nightmare. So she wrote it down and hid it where she hoped it would be safe. Inspector Davies was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I assume you know where Gerald Partridge is now." "I believe he's living in Little Wythorn under the name Grayson. Mrs. Harper has the address of his sister's house, which I suspect is nearby. I had planned to visit there myself before I decided it would be more prudent to contact the authorities." A small smile touched the inspector's face. "Very prudent indeed, Miss Marple. Very well, I'll need formal statements.